LemonAmiga presents a Playguide video review. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Accolade presents
Hi there, welcome to another LemonAmiga game guide and review. This time we'll be taking a look at the 1987 game Test Drive, developed by DSI, Distinctive Software Incorporated, and published by Accolade. Before we get to see the game itself, we must choose our ride from one of 5 different vehicles. By pulling up and down on the controller, we can choose any one of those 5 vehicles: the Porsche 911, the Chevy Corvette, the Lamborghini Countach, Ferrari Testarossa, and for this guide and long play I'll be choosing the Mark II Lotus Turbo Esprit. The aim of this 3D driving simulator is to simply test drive a car and drive that thing down the road as fast as humanly possible and to get to the checkpoint. The faster you do that, the more score you will gain, and the more you crash out, veer off the road, the less score you will gain. At the end of 5 stages, all your scores will be totalled up and you will be presented with a high score table. As you can see, this is playing on an Amiga 1200, so the frame rates are slightly faster than the new 500 experience, but I think on the 1200 the game is certainly playable. On this first level, all the player has to do is to drive the car virtually in a straight line and in top gear. All these corners are relatively easy and the traffic, as you can see, is virtually non-existent. All you can do is to watch the roadside barriers, and if you go off, then you'll crash and you'll die. Unlike Test Drive 2, when you go off the side, you won't see a visual representation of that. What will happen is your windscreen will crack and you will see a visual representation of a crash. Each crash will remove one of the 5 lives that we start the game with, and if we make it to the checkpoint we are given an extra 2 lives, which means we can have 2 crashes on every level and still get through to the end of the game. The player will also lose a life if we collide with any of the traffic or scraping along the cliff face you can see ever present there on the right hand side. Occasionally the road will widen and allow for 2-lane traffic, which will certainly help us overtake those cars later on, but for the moment level 1 is relatively easy. When you get to the end of level 1 you can see a sign there saying the gas station is 1 mile ahead. All you have to do is to get there and the car will automatically pull into the gas station and reveal your status. "123 miles per hour there gives me 12,000 points on the first level. The unique feature of Test Drive for its time was the fact that the player could take on any one of these 5 cars, each of which has different variables and statistics, different acceleration and brake force, different cornering ability, and so the vehicle which you choose in this game really does make a tremendous difference to the feel of the gameplay. This is the Lamborghini, and as you can see when you select that vehicle, you see a unique introduction sequence as the guy opens that door and drives away. That's certainly something that I enjoy in the Test Drive series, and you can see each vehicle has its own dash, which has been drawn to resemble a real interior of the real vehicle. driving the Lambo isn't a bad compromise because the Lamborghini has one of the highest top speeds and has fast acceleration, and the cornering of the Lamborghini is actually quite sharp. So sometimes the Lamborghini is certainly a good car to try in Test Drive 1. Unfortunately the sound lets it down, and as I gear up to high gear there, it sounds a bit like driving a diesel Lamborghini rather than a 5 litre V12. Similar story really on the Porsche. The acceleration isn't too bad and the cornering isn't too bad, but although not as fast as the Lamborghini, it still sounds just as bad. You can see I'm trying desperately to find a higher gear, but 4th gear is as fast as it will go, and it sounds like a tractor. Let's check out the Ferrari. It looks like I've actually maxed out the gears before I've even started. Yes, it is possible to lose a life just by revving those engines too high, and that will break the engine and you will lose a life. Acceleration isn't too bad on the Ferrari, but the road holding certainly leaves a lot to be desired at high speed, and because that thing has a 5-speed gearbox, it takes quite some time to wind that thing up there. The red backlit dash is certainly interesting there, but the only car which offers digital speedometers in this game is actually the Corvette, which to my mind is the slowest and most uncontrollable car in the entire game. If this is supposed to be a Corvette, then the programmers must be having a joke. For one thing, the first gear in this car is very short. And it's so easy to over-rev that thing, trying to get some speed out of the engine without realising you are maxing first gear out. The other thing is it sounds like you are driving a bus. As we make our way towards 100 miles per hour, it feels like we are accelerating at the speed of a bus, and it also sounds that bad as well. 116 miles per hour, and yet we still can't negotiate the red driver. So how fast was the red driver going? Collision detection is also at a premium, especially when driving down the middle of the road, and there is no safe place to hide in the middle of the road, which, as we shall see on Test Drive 2, is a crucial factor. So here we are back in the Lotus. This is level 2, and as you can see it's pretty much identical to level 1 except for different bends. And even the traffic levels there, you might come across one vehicle every so often, and that is on the surface a very good thing because it means the player can get a tremendous speed out of their vehicle, and that 65 miles per hour road sign gives away the fact that the bends aren't particularly sharp on the second level, so it doesn't really introduce the player to anything new. In fact, all 5 levels are pretty much identical, and it's almost as though you begin at the bottom of a mountain and spiral your way all the way to the top, and at the end of the game the car dealership is right at the top, because you notice there the cliffs are always on the right hand side. You might wonder where in the world you might find such a long stretch of cliffs there. In the top left corner you can see the red lights, and as we shall see later on, that is actually a police trap which we've just driven straight through at high speed. You may also notice I've acquired a speck of dirt, which was a fly which landed on my windscreen, my windshield, which unfortunately we do not have wipers in this game, so we can't flick on the wipers, and another bug on the windshield there, so we have 2, and a very near miss by weaving in the middle of 2 vehicles. The art of Test Drive is plucking up enough courage to weave at high speed between vehicles, so that's the very first time we've seen that effect in the game. And apart from that, it is pretty boring still on this second level. The flies make it difficult to see through the windshield, but at this stage all the player needs to do if they find a difficult bend like this one is to take a deep breath and gear down and avoid the side of the road. You can see the police radar there is already flashing, and in my rear view mirror you can see a police car. In Test Drive 1 you won't hear any sounds of the police cars, so the only way you'll get to see those is by observing that rear view mirror. And if you are over 100 miles per hour, or at least 120 in this game, then you will outrun the police, and as you saw, the police car faded into the background. On these earlier levels the police are rather slow, and the game gets harder as the game goes on, so the police on the later levels are certainly difficult to avoid. But let's just weave our way around the last difficult bend and automatically pull into the gas station. "113 miles per hour, it took me 2 minutes, and that's worth 10,000 points. So let's head on into level 3, where we find the first of our difficult corners, which, as you will see, are heralded by yellow signs on the side of the road. Taking a look at the history, Test Drive 1 was created by DSI, a Canadian company based in Vancouver, which was set up by Don Matrick and Jeff Sember in 1982. After their first title, Evolution, which was released amongst other things on the Commodore 64, did well. They then created Hardball and then Test Drive. From 82 all the way up to 87 they didn't produce any games, and Test Drive was the fruit of all their labours. Don Matrick headed a team of 15 guys on this project, and Don went on to code Test Drive 2, Grand Prix Circuit in 89, the Cycles in 89, and 4D Sports Driving in 1990 on the Amiga, and also Hardball 2 as well in 1990. He was aided by Brad Gower, who once again went on to do Test Drive 2, Grand Prix Circuit, the Cycles, and 4D Sports Driving. And the other coders included Bruce Dawson, Rick Friesen, and Kevin Picknell. The graphics were created by John Bowkler and Tony Lee, who would code many more graphics on the Amiga, and the music and sound effects were done by Patrick Payne and Rick Milson. I have to say, the graphics, the 3D graphics of the day, were actually pretty well done, and the sound, well, apart from the sounds of some of the car's engines, I like the way the car bumps over roadside rocks and the cat's eyes running down the centre of the road. So those sound effects and that music is just enough for the game. Most of the in-game music, including the title screen, is well done, and the title music is actually quite catchy, although the game complete music is probably the worst music I've ever heard on the Amiga. Test Drive made it to a number of machines, including the Amstrad and the Atari ST. You can see the Apple II version there is very badly coloured and purple vehicles there, while the Commodore 64 version is very admirable. In fact, it's almost a one-to-one copy of the 16-bit versions, except for the traffic, which are a little on the blocky side. Even the sound effects on the 64 are great, which compares to the diabolical sound on the PC. Meanwhile, on the Amiga, I'm just about to run through yet another speed trap, and that will alert the police. On level 4, it becomes difficult to outrun the police, because often you have to gear down to avoid these dangerous corners, and that basically throws you into the clutches of the police cars behind. You can see in the rearview mirror the police went straight through that traffic, and yes, in Test Drive 1 there is no collision detection with police cars, so you can put any number of cars between you and the police and they will simply keep coming unless you manage to get over that magic 100 or 120 miles per hour safety zone. So compromises have to be made between gearing down and saving a life, or careering to the edge of that cliff face and potentially losing a life. Avoiding the law in this game can either deliver a speeding ticket, which actually slows the car down by maybe 20 seconds, or if they crash then they will lose 20 seconds from their time, and obviously time is important when you are trying to complete these levels as quickly and as safely as possible. The controls are certainly responsive to handle the game, despite the fact that each one of these cars handles very differently indeed, and the one 5-button Amiga classic joystick control works fine. The graphics are just about enough, and in 1987, well, what could you hope for on the graphics front? And, well, sound and playability is rather average. Actually, in 1987, when you didn't have much to compare this to, probably the game holds up reasonably well. But the scores for this game were pretty low, considering the LemonAmiga crew gave this a 6.8 out of 10. Amiga Computing Volume 1 Issue 1 gave this a 6 out of 10 in June 1988. Commodore User gave this a 7 out of 10. Ace gave it an 8 out of 10, and the Games Machine gave it a 69%, complaining that the game suffered too much from hype and glamour, but not enough substance on the programming front. I think Test Drive 1 is actually a very playable game, depending on which car you choose to play it with. Certainly with the Lotus, I found that enjoyable, and on Amiga 1200 the graphics flow just about quickly enough to have the great Test Drive experience delivered to you. I'd probably give this title a 7 out of 10, mainly because it is surprisingly controllable and not what I'd call a bad game. In fact, there are one or two programming tricks used to make this game extra special, including the rear view mirror and the bugs, but the graphics are just a bit too samey and the levels just a bit too samey to really make this game stand out. You can see I'm getting through the last level there. This is level 5, and a few tricky corners and a few easy overtakes later and we'll complete the game. I'm headed on down into another speed trap at the moment, and you can see the traffic is very slightly heavier than it was on level 1. You'll still only find 2 cars every few minutes, or at least every few seconds, rather than a multitude of cars there, and police presence is now on my tail. All I've got to do is to avoid this traffic, gear down and hightail it out of there, and you can see despite my best efforts the police yet again are still on my tail. I'm gearing up there to 5th gear, but because we have someone following us, the police trap there that you can see flashing will be ineffective because we already have a police chase, so we don't need 2, and I guess 2 police cars on our tail would have been twice as good as just the one. But you saw there I had to gear down because of that very tight bend, and the rocks on the side of the road will actually slow us down if we drag the car along those rocks. But when the police catch us, then they will overtake, and then you will find that the steering locks out and you can no longer drive the vehicle. All you can do is to brake, gear down, back to neutral, and the police will eventually get out of their chariot, slap a fine on our front screen, and then casually drive away. In the meantime, given a few seconds, we eventually gain control over our vehicle again, and we can rev the engine up and set off. Sometimes I've noticed playing Test Drive 1 that getting a police chase and gaining a ticket is actually faster than driving off the edge of the road or crashing and losing 20 seconds just like that. In fact, sometimes getting a police ticket only loses maybe 15 seconds, and sometimes you can use the police lockout to drive around really fast corners, because while you are locked out as the police try to overtake you, you can no longer drive. But the good news is, when you move the car around a very tight corner, you can no longer crash either. So sometimes you can simply gear up, and while the police have that lock on, we can steer around very tight corners and actually make our way faster than if we'd have crashed. So survivability in this game is always recommended. Again, I'm trying to gear down there to try and avoid the police, but the police have caught us, and under normal circumstances when we get to this point, we should pass the 1 mile to go fuel indicator sign, and that should mean only a few bends to the finish. But actually, because this is level 5, we have to traverse a very difficult red car on a bend and then throw the car in there to the dealership. That's what should happen, but in this case I passed the sign and I had a police car on my tail. As you can see, my steering wheel is fully locked on to the left, and so by any other means I should be able to overtake that driver in front, or at least drive off the edge of that cliff. But because we are locked on there, because the police have locked out our controls, we can no longer steer around that vehicle, and all we can do is potter along at 30 miles per hour and remain behind it. But the police can no longer overtake us, and that's certainly a bug in the game. Finally, after all that, we go to the end of level, end of game sequence and listen to some terrible music before we enter our score into the higher score table. Test Drive 1 might not be the most playable game in the world, and it certainly doesn't show off the Amiga's 16-bit capabilities when the 8-bit Commodore 64 could virtually match it graphic for graphic. But at a time when the only 3D racer was in fact Revs, released in 1984 on the BBC and the Commodore 64, I think it still stands out to this day. And that's Test Drive completed. On to our next game.
Accolade presents the Dual Test Drive 2.
2 years later, in 1989, an expanded DSi crew came together and produced Test Drive 2. This time the music was produced by Chris Hatlid. As we begin Test Drive 2, we see a brand new options menu, and from here we can choose our vehicle. But unlike Test Drive, we were only given 2 vehicles in Test Drive 2, the Ferrari F40 and the Porsche 959. That was unless you have the data discs, of which I have in this expansion, of which we shall see later. And on the data discs we were given a few more expanded models of cars. So on the Amiga 500 I'm going to select this Lotus Turbo Esprit Mark III. So yes, we can play Lotus even before Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge was released, and we can also select the difficulty. Let's select difficulty level 4 for this, which should mean automatic gears and far less traffic on the road. By pushing forward we can accelerate and press fire to change a gear. Up and fire to gear up, down and fire to gear down. Unfortunately, on the Amiga A500 we find the frame rates are a little on the slow side. This is supposed to be a fast driving simulator, and even though we are supposed to be travelling 80 miles per hour, it certainly feels like 20 miles per hour, and it doesn't really show off the Amiga's immense graphic shifting capabilities to the maximum. But if you had a PAL Amiga in Europe, you could simply switch your machine to NTSC mode, and that will increase the speed of your machine by 20%. So we can achieve that by adjusting the frames per second to 60 on WinUAE, or if you have an Amiga, if you select the NTSC option in the boot menu, that will mean the music and the graphics of the game run 20% faster.
Accolade presents
For this play guide we'll select the timed mode, and we shall see the competitive mode a little later, and for this we'll select the Ferrari on the hardest difficulty mode. You can see the NTSC version has already passed the 55 miles per hour sign, whereas the PAL version is struggling to catch up. So that 20% difference, that 60 frames per second instead of 50, really makes a huge difference on this game. This will be a long play, so all you have to do on level 1 is to get into that top gear as soon as possible, steer around these easy corners, trying to get to the checkpoint in as short a time as possible. To make life a little difficult, on level 1 we find 2 cars heading in opposite directions, and if you find those head on, there you go, you have to slip between those at high speed and pick the braking point, which should be here, and drag the car across and stop between those 2 lines in order to make the checkpoint. If you stop before those lines it won't count, and after those lines it will count as a life lost. So you have to be accurate on that braking point, and we're on to level 2 already. As you can see, the graphics do vary in this game. This isn't Test Drive 1. We do find different graphics and different sceneries, and well, you can see the same cliffs there and deserts this time, replacing the ordinary brown that we found on Test Drive 1, but that scenery will change a little later. And you saw a roadside piece of graffiti there, so the programmers have added 1 or 2 touches to this game, and we're back to the cliffs. In this level 2, again, you have to drive like a bat out of hell, get that thing up to 5th gear. Top gear is pretty much as fast as possible, and that will mean that you can slip by these 2 vans just about without going off. But by far the hardest part of this level is the next section. Just under this tunnel, you'll find 2 vans parked very close together, and I always have to gear down at that point, because the vehicles materialise at random. They will materialise at slightly random places in the road, but because those vehicles are programmed, you will always find the same vehicle in the same place. And if you put the difficulty level on high, you will make sure that every vehicle in the game will materialise, so that makes the game pretty much predictable, which means these levels can be memorised. The hardest part is perhaps memorising the braking point, and just on that corner there is particularly the best place on level 2. If you're in high gear or 5th gear, you can judge that point, and you notice we have 7 lives there, but not quite as fast as I have done that level. 67,000 versus 69,000 points. At the end of each section, the player will gain an extra life, so 7 lives is certainly a great position to be in as we go on to level 3. Level 3 introduces the player to another unique aspect of Test Drive 2, and that is the fact that the centre of the road is actually the best place to be. If the player manages to position their vehicle perfectly in the centre of the road, just to the right there of that blue dot which indicates our position on the steering wheel, they should find that they can simply slip through the gaps in the traffic. Of course, this doesn't make life much easier when the difficult bends are here to throw the player off the road, and you can see me tank slapping the vehicle there, trying to wrestle that thing back under control. And yes, you can do things like that in this game. The driving physics have been improved since Test Drive 1, although playing at these very high speeds, I noticed the cars just don't seem to have that kind of grip and will slide off the road pretty easily. So the best thing to do is to maintain a central position in the road, and when you are passing vehicles, gear down and pray nothing materialises in the opposite lane, or, well, you can sometimes slip by traffic, but you have to be really brave if you need to do that. Otherwise, on this level, it is best to return to the centre of the road as quickly as possible. That will mean even the police are unable to follow us, and on this game, yes, the police do get restricted by the traffic, and they will crash into the rear of traffic if one of those vans decides to pull out there at the wrong time, so at least they have bug fixed that. In fact, the police in this game seem to have a noticeable increase in their AI, and will drive better than they did in Test Drive 1, and you'll hear their police sirens wailing there as soon as you tag them. You saw the police officer waiting there with a speed trap, determined to catch me. All you need to do is to get that car in high gear again and to shake them off. There are hints and tips of how to get rid of the police, as we shall see on the next level, but for now the best tip is to simply drive like a cat on a hot tin roof and to evade them. If you can't, you can see I'm locked out. My skills have defeated me yet again, and look at that, we passed the milestone. We managed to get all the way to the end of that level. We can actually see the checkpoint, and that police officer gives us a ticket in sight of the line. Well, how frustrating is that? May as well gear down, and without revving the engine, it takes quite some time to speed up and slow down. Even though we'd received 1 speeding ticket, we still now have 8 lives remaining because we haven't crashed, and well, 48,000 compared to 71,000 I could have won on that level. There certainly is a big difference in scores if you don't get stopped by the law. On level 4, it's important to get into those high gears pretty early, as we return to a quite familiar scene with those ever endless cliffs on the right hand side. But you see that blue car there? It's important to gear down into 3rd gear at that point, and then when you speed off, that will evade the law. In Test Drive 2, the police will chase you at the speed you were when you passed them. So, in other words, if you were in 3rd gear, then the police will chase you at 70 miles per hour in 3rd gear, and if you were in 5th gear at the time, travelling 100 miles per hour, then the police will chase you all the faster. For this reason, it is important to always drive slowly when passing police cars, and if you drive within the speed limit, they will pass you and leave you alone. That's yet another ticket for us, but that's still probably easier and certainly better on the time than actually wrecking the car in a crash or an off. For the really big scores in this game, of course, you must avoid having a crash or an off, or even getting involved with the police. So, memorising these courses and being brave, and I find these levels are just that bit more playable and just that bit more interesting than Test Drive 1. Certainly in Test Drive 2 the scenery has changed and the sound effects have had a nice polish. The cars don't seem to grind like you are driving a tank anymore, although if they did release Test Tank as a driving simulator, I'm sure that would be just as fun. The playability is there and the controllability is there, but with only 2 cars on the original discs and without any expansions or speed on the original A500 version. The original release in 1989 wasn't the best release, and when I played this I was slightly disappointed that the game just didn't quite run as fast as I'd hoped. But nevertheless, you can see me slowing right down there, crawling to a stop, because after that sign is actually a hidden police checkpoint, and as long as we are around 50 miles per hour we can cruise, observing the roadside markers which denote the speed limit, and in this case it's 55 miles per hour. So yes, we can avoid the police presence if we simply slow down for those markers, and it's important to avoid that traffic for a particularly hard bend before we get to the end of this level. You can see a fly has made its way onto my windscreen yet again, and it's those little touches that give Test Drive 2 that bit of extra longevity. So let's pull it on in there before we get stopped by the police again, and that's the end of level 4. 9 lives remaining. Let's see how we did. Not quite as good as my top score ever, but then again my top score ever is quite difficult to beat. So on to the next level. Level 5 is actually quite difficult indeed. In fact, it may be the hardest level on the entire game, mainly because the police line the road, and every few cars you'll find a police car heading in the other direction, or a police trap there waiting for you. So the only thing you can do is to drive down that centre of the road, and unfortunately this winding through a forest is actually pretty winding, and look at that, as soon as you try to overtake a car, you have to be very, very, very lucky to overtake a car in the centre of the road on a bend. And yes, it is possible, but you have to line that up perfectly there, otherwise it's gear down, and well, if the driver doesn't make any mistakes and drives slow enough, then they shouldn't have any crashes on these roads whatsoever, and so it's up to the player what they decide to do. If you crash into any road signs on Test Drive 2, then that might have a significant impact on your driving ability, because you'll find gears suddenly break and you will over rev in a gear, which means you have to gear up or down before your engine blows, and well, mufflers can go as well and engine problems, but usually a gear will suddenly disappear from your gearbox by driving over those roadside markers. And yes, we have just been stopped by the police yet again. Sometimes you can drive and get away with that, but most times, particularly on this level 5, you can't. As I say, the police more or less line the road in level 5, so rather than get stopped yet again, I've noticed in the police trap, so the best thing to do is to get that thing onto the right miles per hour. In this case it's 60, and as long as I maintain that 60, cruise on down, I can now accelerate. So let's compare the other versions. Test Drive 2 was available for the Apple, the PC, the MSX and the Commodore 64. And you can see the 64 graphics are slightly darker than you would expect. The PC is more or less a faithful rendition, maybe not quite as good VGA graphics there, and the MSX, well, that's a lot like the ZX Spectrum version. So let's have a look at the ZX there with its monochrome colour scheme. Well, surprisingly it is very smooth. You don't get many cars on the ZX Spectrum version, you do get crashes. The SNES version there is a very nice graphical update and certainly smoother with dual highways, and well, the Sega Mega Drive probably is the best conversion of this particular game. The Test Drive series did go on after Test Drive 2. Test Drive 3 appeared on the PC and almost the Amiga in 1990. Test Drive 4 happened on the PC and the PS1 in 1997. Test Drive 5, then Test Drive 6 appeared in 1999 for the PC, the Dreamcast and the Game Boy Color, and then Test Drive Eve of Destruction and Test Drive Unlimited, right up to Test Drive Unlimited 2, which was released on the current next generation machines in 2011. Back to the game once again, we find ourselves on Stage 6. Stage 6 sees us back in the desert, and is the final stage in this Test Drive, the original Master Disc. Once again, the level is thick with cops, so what I like to do is to gear down and to evade those cops. As soon as you see those things disappearing in your rearview mirror, wait 2 or 3 seconds and then floor it. I've noticed when you wait for those guys to disappear and floor it straight away, sometimes they hear your tyres screeching and come after you anyway. So it's best to slow down and make sure they are far enough away for you to make an escape. On this level 6 I'm crashing quite a few times because these difficult bends are difficult enough to drive around at high speed, and yes, speed still has to be maintained on these very difficult bends. It's probably a good idea to place the car in 4th gear and use 4th gear to negotiate the level, and then you can simply gear down into 3rd if you need to negotiate a hard bend, just like that. And if for some reason you can get through that traffic, then well, you can get away with it. If not, well, you lose a life. There really is no mercy on these later levels. It's nice to see the gauges in the car, the engine temperature and the oil pressure actually work in this game, and the analog speed and revs. But pulling those manoeuvres has attracted police attention yet again, so it's the cops and robbers chase again, and it's the cannonball run, so all we have to do is to survive, and well, you know what this game's like, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Just by steering wildly, you might notice the police crashed into the oncoming traffic in my rearview mirror, and that's certainly the best way to get rid of the police, because then they can't follow you any longer. The worst way is probably to crash. I have to say, when I first played this game, I was actually very impressed by the driving model, and in its infancy, those Test Drive games in their day certainly inspired me to take up that driving ability myself in real life. And could I equate this to a driving lesson? Well, I don't think so. Learning driving in this game is probably about as good and as accurate as learning GTA 5. You can learn how to avoid drifts and things like that, but as far as real driving abilities go, you'll probably only learn how to crash. The magazine reviewers gave this roughly 80%, and Amiga Action gave it 75%. That's the budget release. CU Amiga gave it 77%, The One gave it 78%, Ace gave it 88%, the LemonAmiga crew gave this 74%. So a mixed bag there, but Ace with its 88% said this was exciting and as realistic as you'd expect from a top-class driving simulator. Well, in the day, it certainly was. On the Amiga version, I'm just about to get my final police chase, so let's get that guy on my tail, and it's a simple straight road all the way to the finish from here. Just avoid that van and try and get that thing back in a straight line. Yes, as soon as you can stick to that centre of the road, you can get to the end of the game. At the end of the game, you'll find a finish line, and all you have to do is stop after that line. You can carry on there and stop at your leisure, but you can see 21,000 points versus 34,000, which is my highest. It is possible to complete the game without any law presence or accidents, and you will gain a smile from the police officer. Otherwise, she will clap you in irons and you will be arrested for a long list of driving offences. This all adds to the humour and the character of this game, which really shines through on the Amiga, and I think the graphics, particularly those still screens, are well drawn, and the game certainly has character of its own. Even at the end, someone sprays "Game Over." Game over, man! And Bill Paxton from the Aliens movie is there to close the picture on the Amiga. After which there is the final humiliation of the high score table, and in this particular case we will find that I am absolutely nowhere near my highest high score, 360,000, so let's skip on through to the expansion discs. Expansion discs were released not long after the game, the first of which was released in the next year and contained a level expansion known as the California Challenge. So with that expansion in the machine, let's have another timed run and see what that's all about. The California Challenge is expansion pack number 1, and as you can see the scenery does change. On this expansion pack we must drive from Northern California on the border with Oregon, driving through the Redwood State Parks, on our way through to Crescent City, through Bodega Bay, and down through San Francisco, LA, and down towards the Mexican border. In fact, the Mexican border, as soon as you get through to San Diego, is the last destination on this California Challenge, so basically the length of California must be driven. Up in the mountains there we can see driving isn't particularly easy when all these bends are trying to throw us off, but you can see the formula doesn't really change on this expansion disc. Nothing has changed graphically or sonically. In fact, the only change are a number of vehicles, the difficulty of the police, and of course the layout of the roads are different, along with the trees on this level. So at least we do get variances of trees on these levels, and it's a pity that these graphics updates weren't particularly amazing on the graphical update front. They basically bolted on extra sprites into the engine and didn't bother updating the engine, but you can see a truck there as we make our way through the trees and out of the forest, where we pick up the coast road on our way down through Eureka. And yes, place signs are by the sides of the road if the player can stop and read those as they whiz past at 120 miles per hour. But these roads certainly are difficult. You can see the number of crashes I'm going to have to put up with on this level, because simply the traffic is difficult, just as difficult as Test Drive 2, the main disc. In fact, the traffic with the expansion disc is just as unforgiving as probably the hard levels. And yet towards the end of this section the level really does open out and cruise its way to the exit. It really is good that the programmers of this game spent the time and the trouble to release these data discs, out of which some fun can be gained. But the graphics, as you can see as we return to the forest, they are reasonably well drawn, but then they are highly reminiscent of each other, dare I say samey, and the trees make sure that the vehicle cannot career off the road and have any off-road antics. And yes, Test Drive Off-Road was another spin-off of the Test Drive series, spawning 3 or 4 addendums by itself. But as you can see, I've speeded up this forest footage here to get me through this level, and even with the speeded up footage, sometimes overtaking cars at this speed is quite thrilling, counteracted by the speed of a crash when you collide head on with those things, and the chore of getting yourself arrested. But apart from those things, Test Drive the expansion discs are a worthy inclusion to the Test Drive series, but most people didn't really have access to those, and they didn't go out and spend the $11.99 it took to purchase those, and they weren't really highly available in game shops, and they were a specialist order from back catalogues and mail orders, that kind of thing. So check out the data discs. Certainly there was another one released after this. Data disc number 4 contained the European Challenge, where players got to drive through Italy and Switzerland and France and Germany in the European Challenge, and that game is more or less graphically similar to this. They really haven't coded anything new to that. And Northern California, you'd expect the Golden Gate Bridge to appear on the horizon for you to drive over that thing eventually and get yourself into California, but you can't. You can see the road here opens up into a 4-lane highway momentarily as we rise over this mountain, but all too quickly that road disappears, leaves the normal road, and looking at the horizon you can actually see the Golden Gate Bridge, but that's as close as we're going to get. Avoid the car and on to the next level. DSi went on to create Super C and Wings of Fury on the Amiga in 1990 before getting both out in 1991 by Electronic Arts. Since then their titles have been merged and, well, DSi was no more. The distributor of this series was the well-known Accolade, based in San Jose there in California. We may be driving by where they were based. Accolade produced the Hardball series, the Jack Nicklaus series, Fast Break, Altered Destiny, Bar Games, which I was surprised about, and in 1993 they created Waxworks for the Amiga, which was probably the last thing they ever developed for the Amiga, because they got taken over in 1999 by Infogrames, which was then just about to be taken over by Atari. So basically Accolade's back catalogue are now in the hands of Atari. But that wasn't all bad news, because the founder of the whole thing, virtually, Mr. Don Matrick, Don went on to become a member of Microsoft. In fact, he became a senior vice president at that company in 2007, given the project of taking on the Xbox 360. And it was up to him that the Kinect works on the Xbox 360. He pioneered that, and yes, recently the Xbox One was unveiled, and in 2013 you may have seen Don Matrick out there on the Xbox 360 advertising the new Xbox One, which he currently manages. So I'm sure you will all agree that since we are now in 2013, he's certainly driven a long way since his humble beginnings out there in Vancouver. But he's still very much living in LA, and so he's very much in that California culture that we are driving through right now, and we have reached the end of this level. That was section 6, so this should hopefully be the last level of the lot. So let's see how far we get. Zuma Beach there, and accurately laid out road signs to pick where we are, and hopefully we should be heading towards the border, on the Mexican border there. So Santa Monica, not far to go. And I like the way the road opens out there periodically and gives us a lay-by, but yes, the road should really open up and give us a lay-by more often than that, because so often than not it's a choice of getting in the centre of the road and virtually cheating, or if you risk going out there, then, well, you're doing it blind and you have to hope that whatever comes your way it won't run into you. And San Diego there. So the skill involved in driving in this game is still beyond a joke, unless you drive down the road perfectly, and getting it in that spot every single time isn't always easy, but having done so, once you do, here's the US border. All we have to do is get to the finish, and again, as soon as you get to that finish, or before it, hopefully, slam on, and that should get you over the line. We made 325,000 points on that run, which, well, you might be able to score 400,000 on a complete run, and it doesn't really give you, well, it doesn't give you any points whatsoever if you get a clean run, so there's no extra impetus to get a clean run. But just in case you were worried that I'd forgot the other aspect of the duel, yes, it's called Test Drive 2 The Duel, and that means you get to race any car against the computer. I'm going to show you the expansion pack here. This is the second expansion pack, and here we find all the cars from the first game. The Lamborghini there, and a Lotus, the Testarossa again from the first game, and a slightly improved Corvette ZR1. Also in the expansion discs you get muscle cars from the 1970s Palm Shark GTO there. It's a bit of the expansion pack doesn't include modern sports cars, but Dodge there, and well, those stats are quite so much slower than the Ferrari F40, and all these muscle cars are just there basically as expansions, which you had to buy as extra cars. and those for fanatics only probably. For this I'm going to select the Ferrari, and I'm going to select the Northern Germany Challenge. Let's see if we can score more than 300,000 on this one. And for this challenge I shall go against the computer, and of course it goes without no doubt whatsoever, my skill level is going to be Pro. You can see some flickering there. Why is that? Well, that's because on the emulator you have to select cycle exact. It doesn't really matter whether it's in A1200 or A500, but that cycle has to be exact for that flickering to not flicker anymore. And yes, let's bump it up there to 60 frames per second, and that sounds better. And so we can set off. This Northern Germany Challenge was created by a fan of the game, posting on EAB as Mombasa Joe in January 2013, announced that he'd completed a hacked version of Test Drive 2, featuring 6 brand new tracks featuring northern territories of Germany. And well, as you can see, the hacked version isn't a bad job. The aim of this game is the duel, and we have to outrun and outrace a car that is behind us, and if we make mistakes that car will catch up. This time it isn't just so much as a race against the clock. It doesn't matter how long you take, as long as that guy does not catch up, and that's the aim of the duel. Clean driving is a must. You can't afford to go off, and so at the same time you have to drive conservatively to make sure that you stay in one piece. So using our old friend, the driving down the centre of the road method, and keeping that yellow dotted line more or less on the very centre of that rev counter, we can drive down the centre of that road, get to the end, and overcook the line there, but just about managed to make it within there. And look at that, I crashed twice. That incurred a 40-second penalty, but the computer crashed a number of times, incurring a 1 minute 40 penalty. The computer AI, I'm afraid, doesn't drive very well. He can outrun you, yes, he can try to overtake you, and you can see I am burning rubber here, and he's driving excessively fast, trying every trick in the book to stay up with me. 1 gear down and he's through. What can you do? Well, you can either drive like a maniac to catch up to him, or at the same time slow down, because if he crashes, bang, there we go. If he crashes in front of you, you'll find a wreck sitting in the middle of the road, and just like Vroom, you'll have to avoid that thing at the very last moment. And so driving down the road not knowing where you're going, because these bends are impossible to memorize, and not knowing when the guy is going to overtake you, because that guy is very fast and he's pre-programmed to know the road. Driving precariously behind a car, expecting it to crash at any moment and you to crash along with it, isn't my idea of heaven, and off-roading in this case resulted in a life over. And so this scenery disc isn't easy, and it's for professional drivers, and yet the very first time I tried this scenery disc I actually flew straight through it. So you never know, in this game you can be tremendously lucky, and of course I broke the world record there. Not so hard on a brand new game such as this. It was only released at the beginning of this year, 2013, so any fan of Test Drive 2 is more than recommended to check this out. I've actually no idea where I'm going on this game, and driving over bridges at high speed is difficult enough, so only just missed that one. So sometimes gearing down when you don't know the road is the best thing to do, and I have to suffer that defeat. But look at that. You'd expect the police to get me, but no, he crashes into me. That driver is insane, he's crazy. And that's a blown gear there, just driving by some dirt on the side of the road. And you can see those boulders in the centre. If you collect those, then they will do damage, just like road signs. And they can blow gears. Blowing gears in this case isn't easy to do, but certainly if you hit those things, sometimes you can't avoid it. And look at this, 2 cliffs on either side there. This hack version certainly gives a graphical treat above and beyond the usual test drive game. You can even see plant life growing in the sides of those walls there as I take it easy and thread my way through this canyon. Certainly a canyon is a bit easier of a prospect than a sheer cliff which is winding forever on the right hand side of the screen. Though I have to say an upgrade in the driving physics wouldn't have hurt this game too badly. The sliding aspect is only just bearable as a driving simulator. And slow down there for the police. Always slow down there for the police as you thread your way through these things. And oh, just unlock at the wrong time. Sometimes it's so easy to do that on corners, and even if you do know about the sticking in the middle of the road trick, like I do, it's still not easy. So let's make our way now through northern Germany, and the background graphics have been changed there by the new coder, and he obviously changed these background signs too. Well, in this case the computer has beaten me to the end of the challenge, so that wasn't a very successful challenge for me. This is the last level I will be showing you in this play guide, and I hope I've given you a few tips as to how to negotiate this game. And well, I hesitate to say driving simulator, but certainly this game, it's highly playable, and just like the real car, you can throw the car into the ditch. That let the computer player through, and it took quite some time for me to catch him up again. Luckily, there is a graphical representation of the map at the top of the screen, and you can see a white light, a blue light and a red light, and they represent your opponent, the police and you. By observing that visual representation of a map, you can assume that the edge of the screen represents the end of the level, but really the map is yet another distraction from the main action on screen. In this case, the main action is an autobahn. Yes, that's right, it only took 24 years for me to get to experience this on Test Drive 2. When I first saw this game, I expected some kind of highway level to be in the game as standard. I didn't expect for one moment that the game would be single lane highways, but yes, here we are, the motorway, the highway is here, and the freeway at least. So here we go, this is manoeuvring at high speed through a series of cars on the fastest stretch of the fastest road, but oh no, we've gone off again. One hard corner on the fastest autobahn is enough to throw us off. But let's just enjoy this. I mean, as I say, 24 years to get the one feature that I expected in this game. Yes, I didn't expect to be able to drive all the bridges and see industry and fields and houses in 3D, but I did expect to weave in amongst traffic on at least a 4-lane, maybe even a 6-lane highway. So to get to do it now is an honour. The speed of the NTSC version is terrific, and Achtung 100 meters. Uh-oh, the highway is finishing. Look who it is! Look who's popped up there. Well, I don't think we should spend any time overtaking him, but oh no! I broke too late for the end of the game, and I have to walk home. Well, that's terrific. So, that's the end of the game, that's the end of this review. Thank you for watching another play guide and review to the LemonAmiga titles Test Drive 1, Test Drive 2 and the data discs. That was one of my efforts. It wasn't one of my greatest efforts, I'm afraid, but 300,000 is what I scored the very first time I tried that, and well, that's what I got. So I'll leave you with footage of a brave escape, and maybe we'll see each other again in another play guide review sometime soon.